Hey, welcome back. This is part 2 of the simple 5-step program to changing your life and realizing your dreams, as long as your dreams have to do with solving problems. That doesn't include family problems, medical problems, personal problems, problems with your pets, peeing on your brand new furniture. It only applies to code programming challenges, unfortunately. And I've been viewing this through the lens of interviews, but it really does apply to any sort of code challenge that you're trying to solve on your own. Okay, so step 1 was understand the problem. Step 2, after you've done that, explore concrete examples. So we're back in our cinder block cell. Our interviewer has asked us a question. We have a moment of panic. We start by understanding the question, trying to figure out, make sure we understand the inputs, the outputs, all that stuff we talked about. The very next thing that I do, and I recommend all my students do when we talk about interview prep, is come up with concrete examples. This is tied very closely to understanding the problem. So coming up with examples can help you, can help you understand the problem better. Examples also provide sanity checks so that your eventual solution, once you have a solution, you can tell if it works how it should, because you'll know at that point, you already have the examples. You know the inputs and the outputs that you should get. So if you have those examples, you can check your work. But also you can learn more information by doing these examples. And this applies on a larger scale. Things like user stories. These are examples. If you're not familiar with user stories, it doesn't matter that much, but if you're working on a product, like at Instagram, when they're solving a challenge, they're building a new feature, you bet that they start with user stories at some point they do, which is basically given an input, what is our output? Except the input is, a user action. What should happen after that? Or unit tests on a smaller scale, but still, bigger context than an interview. Unit tests are used all the time to help lay out, how something should work for a smaller feature. Okay, so here are the steps that I take around exploring concrete examples. So you're faced with a problem. The first thing that I do is start with simple examples. And I literally, if I'm in an interview or if my students are in a mock interview, I tell them, all right, you restated the problem already, you understand it. Now write down 2 or 3 simple examples with an input and then the output. And I really actually like to write this down so I have it and I can look back at it. So simple examples, the ones that should make the easiest use cases. Then progress to more complex examples. And then what about edge cases? Explore examples with empty inputs. That will often give you some insight into how the problem should work, especially in an interview setting. Explore examples with invalid inputs. So this is more useful, I'd say, in the real world. What happens if a user enters something that is invalid, right? We have to think about this all the time. So let's explore this with a concrete problem. So our interviewer asks, write a function which takes in a string and returns counts of each character in the string. So relatively straightforward problem, but there are many questions, many examples that we could try out and use to learn about the problem. Okay, so someone just asked me to solve this problem. I'm in an interview. I want to check that I understand it first, so I try and restate the problem, do all the stuff from the last video. Then I like to come up with a couple simple examples to make sure I understand it. So let's say our function is called char count. I would literally write this out. So char count of like A with 4 A's. Well, that should return something that looks like this, I would assume. Returns counts of each character in the string. This is, we've already gathered that it needs to return an object, let's say, instead of an array or some other data structure. So I would try this, and that's how it should work, I guess. Char count of hello should return something like this. But already there's a question that I have, which is, should it just return the letters that are in there? What about the letters that aren't there? Do we want to include, B0 and C0? Because if we did that, it might make our code a lot easier. If every letter was already in there set to 0, then it makes it simpler as we go. We don't have to add in A or B if it's already in there. We just have to increment it. So that's a question that I would try and clarify. So the next step was progress to more complex examples. So what about something like this? If somebody did something like my phone number is blah, 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 and that's not a valid phone number as far as I know. So if this was an input, what would we expect to return? Do we want to account for spaces? That's an important one. What about other characters, $signs, underscores, numbers? That's a big one. Are we going to put numbers in there? And an even more important one that definitely would come up, what about this? Hello, hi. Are there, do we store an uppercase H and a lowercase h? Do we ignore casing? how should this work? Should our object have h uppercase 1, h lowercase 1, or just h 2? So these are more complex inputs in examples that it would really help to understand, and it would help us to simplify the problem or understand it better by asking these sort of questions. These examples are really just another form of understanding the problem better before we tackle it. So it ties into the previous video a lot, understanding the question. Next up, explore examples with empty inputs. So what if, somebody does char count and doesn't pass anything in, like this, or an empty string? What do we want to return? Do we want to return an empty object at the end? Do we want to return null or false or undefined, or maybe an error? And that's tied to exploring examples with invalid inputs. So what if somebody passes in something that isn't a string? They pass in a number, or they pass in an object, or they pass in null. There's all sorts of these edge cases. And understanding these edge cases in an interview setting, often it's not that important usually, but it can be really important in the real world to help you build a more robust solution, something that is more foolproof. So it's still important to keep that in mind. And sometimes it can give you a bit of insight into how the problem works or how you should solve it.